Hello, everyone. I'm so glad we're back together again. It feels like it's been a while. So happy New Year, everyone. I hope you had a good holiday. And I hope you enjoyed that slideshow of our pack members. Thanks to Eric for putting that together for us. I always love seeing all the pictures of the dogs in the pack living their best lives, especially the Frenchie and the cat tree. That was awesome. So glad that you've joined us. Just a reminder that we're live now, but this same link will be available afterwards if you want to share it with anyone. We'd love for you to do that. In the description of the event down below the video, you'll see a link to go to the dog park if you're a member of the dog park. And there's a direct link there for you to put questions in if you have any during this hour. And any questions or comments enter there, we'll enter you to win our giveaway. So make sure you click on that and jump over to the dog park. So without further ado, I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Kiersten Forsyth. Hi.
Hey.
So Kiersten is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Small Animal Clinical Sciences at Texas A&M University. She has completed an internship in small animal medicine and surgery, and that was in Seattle, I think. She has also completed a cardiology specialty internship. And prior to joining the Dog Aging Project, she worked as an emergency room veterinarian. So I'm so thrilled to have you here. And I know that our PAC members will really love getting a chance to ask you some questions about all things genetics and veterinary practice. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
I thought maybe a good place to start would just for you to tell us a little bit about how you ended up at the Dog Aging Project, sort of your professional path here. I always think that's fascinating because we have such a diverse group.
Yeah. So like you said, I've done a rotating internship in Seattle. I did some cardio-specific internships in Florida. And I've worked as an ER doctor. I have a particular interest in cardiology specifically, but I really wanted to get more involved in research. And some of the cardiologists that I worked with were friends with the cardiologists here and also knew Dr. Creevy from the project and kind of put me in touch and recommended that I check out the Dog Aging Project. And I loved what I learned about the project and was happy to join on as a researcher.
We're really so glad to have you as part of the veterinary team. Do you want to tell people a little bit about what specifically you do on the project?
Yeah, so I work with our recruitment and retention group, but then I also work a lot with our TRIAD clinical trial. So for basically anyone who's a part of TRIAD, which is the test of rapamycin in aging dogs, part of that is they will be screened at certain veterinary teaching hospitals. One of those is Texas A&M, which is where I'm based. So for those dogs that come to get screened at A&M, I'm actually the doctor that they'll get to see, and I'll get to meet them and take care of their dog and talk to them and tell them a little bit more about the study.
That's awesome. I'm always jealous of the members of our team who get to interact with our participants and PAC members directly. I think that's awesome. Do you want to, so I guess maybe the question that I want to ask you that I always ask the scientists that are on these calls with me are sort of just about personally, what are you most excited about the research? What do you want to learn? What are you curious about? Where are you hoping this all goes?
Yeah, so I'm really excited to learn what more can we know and what can we do different to help our dogs not only just live longer, but be healthier for longer. Because as a veterinarian, I'm seeing patients, I'm treating these dogs and I want them to be as healthy as possible for as long as possible. And I'm really excited to learn what new information can we get about how we can just help my patients to live longer and happier lives.
So our topic today is really about genetics and the genomic reports. A little bit later, I'm going to give everybody a visual tour through the genomic reports that we give to participants who are in the foundation cohort. But I think we tend to get a lot of questions from a lot of different avenues about the role that genetic information plays in veterinary practice. So that's what I was really excited to talk to you about today. So sort of putting yourself back in the, in the clinical setting, how does genetic data or thinking about genetics influence your evaluation of a client?
Yeah. So I will say most of the time as a veterinarian, you don't get to know genetic information about any individual dog. So usually what we're doing is we're making assumptions based on their breed, because, a breed is a group of dogs who theoretically should be related and have similar characteristics. So we might not know what one individual dog is at risk for, but we can know what certain breeds might be predisposed to. So if I find out a dog is a certain breed, I might think of specific diseases. So I'll use cardio examples because that's kind of my area of expertise.
Sure.
But if I think about if I saw a Cavalier or found out a dog is part Cavalier, those are kind of the poster child for valve disease. Most of them end up with valve disease at some point in their life. So I wouldn't necessarily start doing all of these tests on a dog just because I find out that it's part Cavalier, but I might listen a little bit closer to the heart. I might explain what some of the signs of heart disease might look like for owners so they can be aware of it at home, so that in the future, if the dog does start to show those signs and symptoms, we're all ready for it and we can try to catch these things earlier and try to prevent it from being more of an issue for them in the future.
That makes sense to me. One of the questions we often, or maybe just one of the things we could talk about a little bit, is this idea of breed-specific risk of genetic disease and how a pet owner should use that information, right? Does that mean their dog's automatically going to get this disease? Does it mean they don't need to worry about, like, where do I fall on how much I need to worry if I have a dog that's in one of these breeds?
So just because a breed is at a greater risk for a disease, so you might find out that one breed is at 4 times greater risk for a certain disease, and you think, oh no, that's 400%, that's a big number. But you have to think, how common is that disease actually? Because if this is a disease that is very infrequent or rare, 4 times greater risk might still be a really low risk. So right. Your dog might be at higher risk because of its disease, but in actuality, your dog still might be at pretty low risk for actually getting that disease.
Got it.
So that's where I say, just because you find out your dog is a certain breed, you don't jump to running all of these tests, not unless you're actually seeing signs and symptoms that would indicate that that's an actual worry for your particular pet.
So it's a little bit analogous to human health, where maybe if there's a history of breast cancer in your family, for example, then you might be considering a genetic diagnostic to see if there are potentially genetic markers for breast cancer risk for yourself, your daughters, whatever, right? So just going with that analogy, are there genetic diagnostic tests like that in the veterinary world?
There are a handful of genetic tests that you can test for those ones. When you do send it, you are sending it to a very specific lab that oftentimes it's only one particular lab that runs those certain genetic tests. I'd say probably the most common one that you hear about in dogs is it's called the ABCB1 gene, or it's often known as the MDR1 gene for multi-drug resistance. And it's a gene that for dogs who have a mutation in this gene, they are at risk for having more side effects to certain medications. So this gene, the breeds we most often see it in are like border collies, Australian shepherds, certain types of herding dogs, that they have this mutation more often. And so you can send out a DNA sample to this specific lab to test and see if your dog is positive for this mutation or not. Because if they do, that's going to affect which drugs your doctor might prescribe for your dog if they need it, because there's a number of different drugs that can affect this gene. But I would say not everyone is DNA testing their dog for this one gene to see if drugs are going to be an issue for their dog. But as a veterinarian, you can say, well, is the dog I'm seeing one of the breeds that's at risk for it? If it's at risk, you could consider testing them for it just so you can know. But if testing them is not an option, you can then just be more prepared and say, well, maybe I'll use drugs that are less likely to affect dogs who are positive for this mutation. Or if they do need to take one of those drugs, I'm going to monitor them closely for side effects.
So I just wanted to clarify, are those tests that veterinarians would order, like as opposed to like just me saying, oh, I have a border collie, I'm going to get this thing done?
I'd say more often they're ones that your veterinarian can order, although I believe there are certain ones that you can order yourself. So I think for like the MDR1 gene, you can do it either with a cheek swab, similar to how we collect DNA through cheek swab, but it can also be done as a blood test. So it can be submitted that way. And again, there's not a lot of specific DNA tests for dogs. It's really for very particular genes and very particular diseases. So I think there are a couple related to heart disease, and those are usually done through your veterinarian. They would have to collect the sample that way.
Now, some folks who might have used a commercial DNA test kit for their dogs, those do give some information about potential genetic risk for health, various health conditions, right?
Some of them do. I think it depends on the specific commercial company that you go with for the DNA tests.
A little bit later in this talk, I'm going to show my screen and have all our viewers look at some of the places where they can get more in-depth information about some of this in our various resources. Because one of the questions we get a lot is, how is the DNA kit that we're doing, the DNA testing that we're doing, different from the other commercial tests? And this is one of the key differences, which you will all see when we look through the genetic results report, is that we don't return any kind of medical or veterinary diagnostic information. And just to give a brief explanation for why that is to our viewers, right? Those tests, like the ones you're just talking about, are using known genetic markers for a gene that has a known effect on the health of the dog, right? And so you can design a diagnostic test that just looks for that. We're a little different because we're doing this basic scientific research here. So what we're doing is taking all this information about health condition that we learn from our dogs through the Health and Life Experience Survey and combining that with the genomic information to find new associations. So what we anticipate is that we will discover, oh, look, these dogs with this particular medical condition, they seem to have this consistent mutation over here. And that will be a new discovery that then is something that potentially leads to future diagnostics that can be used in clinical practice. So it's a little different what we're doing. I just want to make sure that our viewers are aware of that. So, and the other thing I wanted that you made me think of when we were talking is about this idea of precision medicine, which is really starting to come into its own in human health. And I'm seeing that is where veterinary medicine is heading to, that perhaps sometime in the not too distant future, we'll be able to have a pretty good idea of the genetic makeup of a patient, and then say, that tells me something about specifically the kinds of medications or interventions or dietary changes that my patient needs, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about sort of, can you see into the future for us, please, about precision medicine for dogs? What's on the horizon in the veterinary community, do you think?
I was going to say, I think it'll be great when we get to that point. We're definitely not there yet. I know that there's research going on with, like you said, people trying to discover these new genetic markers so that we can identify specific problems. I'll fall back to, again, more of my background's in cardiology. I know there are a few specific cardiac diseases that they have found some genes associated with it. So I'd say it's more often done with people who are breeding, but they can get testing done on their dogs to find out if they're carriers or if they're affected with these certain genes, so that they can make a decision on Is this a good pair of dogs to breed to try to reduce the risk of that disease occurring in future puppies? And as the breed as a whole, trying to find ways that we can potentially breed out the disease that's more common. So I'd say that's more of what I've seen in my experience so far with the kind of limited genetic tests we have available so far. Mm-hmm. But it'll be great in the future when we know more of them, and it can be more like what we have so far with the ABCB1 gene, where you can say, I'm going to test and see if my dog is positive for this or not, because that's going to affect what drugs and preventatives and things like that that are prescribed for my dog in the future for their health. So right now we don't have a lot of those tests where we can say, okay, based on my dog's genetic makeup, I should make these choices for his future. But hopefully one day we can get that kind of information.
Yeah, it's coming. So that's exciting to think about for all of us. So I think if you are okay, maybe we'll switch gears just a little bit. We'll walk through our genetic results a little bit, and then go back to Q&A. We can take some questions from the folks who are viewing right now on YouTube, and we've had a lot of questions on the dog park, and we'll take those on. So just by way of introduction, so all of our participants who are members of the Dog Aging Project PAC are eligible for foundation. The foundation cohort is the smaller group of dogs that we send a DNA sample kit to, and then we do a full genome sequencing for those dogs. It's about 10,000 dogs. We wish we could do all the dogs in the pack. That's a funding thing, not anything else, but maybe someday. But because we are a little bit limited in terms of our resources, we are trying to be really careful about the dogs that are invited into foundation to make sure we have a really good balance of mixed breed and purebred dogs, dogs from all over the United States, dogs of different size classes, ages. So all of those decisions go into which dogs end up being invited to submit a DNA sample. Once a dog has done that, and we've sequenced the genome, our genetics team does some really interesting analyses so we can have some cool results to return back to our participants, in addition to all the information that we're using in our various scientific analyses. So I am going to share my screen and show people a few screenshots of this. Okay, but first I get to show you pictures of my dog. Okay, so this is Gilda. She's my dog. And I am going to show you her genomic report. And so you'll see why I'm kind of showing you some pictures of our dog, of her first up. So we do lots of adventure time. In the summer, I keep her hair pretty short because we live in the desert, but in the winter she gets super fluffy. And I wanted you to see the super fluff part because it's relevant for the genomic report. Okay, so proceeding on. How come I can't advance these slides? Oh, I did. Okay, great. So if you've submitted a DNA sample and your genomic report is ready, you'll get an email that says, come back to your portal. Here's the portal. All of you PAC members have seen this. You will see it's time for me to do my annual follow-up survey, so I better get on that. And then if you click down at the bottom where you see genomic report and the little DNA spiral, the next thing that happens is you see a little pop-up where you are asked to consent to view the report. Not everybody wants to view the report. Not everybody wants to know. You know, we certainly have participants who are like, I love this dog. I don't care if it's like half sheep. It is my dog. I don't want to know. But if you want to know, you can consent and move on. The report, I'm going to show you just a variety, sort of screenshots walking through it, starts out looking like this, where we repeat back what you told us in the health and life experience survey. So I reported that Gilda was poodle and other. The next page, and I don't try to read all of this, it's a lot. We sort of talk about how we do the DNA extraction and the initial analysis and what that's about. We show you a picture of the dog that is the top breed represented in your dog's ancestry. So like I said, I knew that her dad was a full standard poodle, so I'm not surprised that she's 50.4% poodle. Now, if you scroll down a little farther in the screen, see where this little purple half circle is? You see a graphic that talks about the most highly represented breeds in your dog's ancestry. So in Gilda's case, she's 36.3% Labrador Retriever, and then a bunch of unknown. Unknown comes from a lot of different places. It could be that it's just very small percentages that can be attributed to other breeds, and they're so small that we don't have confidence in their statistical accuracy. Also could be that there are just things that are not matched in our particular breed reference panel. I know there are some questions about breed reference panel that came up on the dog park. We'll get to those, I promise, and talk a little bit more about how we make these calls. But I just wanted you to know in the report, it gives this information. If you look at this sort of maroon colored bar down on the bottom, it also gives you a statistic that is called the coefficient of inbreeding. And so if a dog were 100% inbred, like a clone, that's at the far right end of this scale. Most dogs are ending up, in the sort of below 35% kind of area, and purebred dogs are still under 50%, right? Because they're not there. There's a lot of genetic variation even within breeds. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Kiersten.
No, I think that's kind of what you said. With most purebred dogs still don't have that much inbreeding. There are certain breeds that there tends to be more inbreeding, but that's just ones that started from a smaller sample population when they first created the breed.
And inbreeding is a word, I think, that tends to have negative connotations, probably because in high school history, we all learned about all of the horrible things that happened to the rulers in Europe. But it's not really a bad thing. And this coefficient of inbreeding is not a measure of goodness and badness in the dog's genetic makeup. It is really just about how much variation is represented in the dog's ancestry. So in general, that is not a number that should freak anybody out. So after we do this sort of general overview of ancestry, if you look at the bottom, there are a whole bunch of trait predictions, which are kind of interesting. And each of those are clickable. So if I click on body size, it pops up something like this. So there are a couple things to keep in mind about this. This measure of body size is about height at the shoulders. So it's not a weight body size, right? Because weight is certainly a lot more influenced by activity and nutrition and all of those things. But skeletal height is much more influenced by genetics. There's a nice little sort of comparison for like, what does tiny mean versus what does giant mean, and gives you a couple of sample species or breeds to compare. The other thing that I think is worth noting on this is that size is a feature that is affected by multiple genes in multiple regions. And that's what you see on this crazy table at the bottom. Tells you the chromosome, the position, what gene is being looked at, or what gene region is being looked at. Possible alleles mean what are the particular variants that can occur at each of those genetic loci. And then since each individual has 2 copies of every allele, it is actually telling me what Gilda's genotype is at those key regions. And then the most interesting part for this body size predictions is that last column where it says effect, right? So a little upward facing triangle means that Gilda's genetic or genotype at that location is a size increaser. or a size decreaser if the little triangle is pointing down. So if you look at that combination, that I didn't screenshot the whole thing, but what you can just see there is that at 2 locations, there are genes that seem to reduce size, and at 4 locations, there are genes that are increasing size, and those work together cumulatively to lead to her skeletal size. And the little purple line on the tan bar puts her right in the large range, which is exactly right for her. So first I see this result, I'm like, nailed it. Excellent. Do you have anything else you want to add about just size and genetics or anything like that? Please interrupt me.
Oh, no, not really. I think just like you said, weight is going to be more influenced by other things. So how athletic they are, what they're eating, other potential diseases they have, whereas height will be affected to some extent, but not nearly the same.
Which is why we ask our pack members all these questions about physical activity and diet. And pretty soon we're going to be asking folks to help us out with more detailed body measurements. And so like, for example, so like musculature, right, is also one of the things that as a veterinarian you care about. Like one of the things we'll ask folks to do is measure their dog's thigh on both sides, the thigh diameter. I don't know, do you want to add anything about why we would do that?
Yeah, because that does seem like a little bit of a weird question to ask someone to measure their dog's thigh. But at that point, what you're looking at is, the thigh has a lot of muscles there. So what you're doing is dogs who tend to have a larger circumference around their thigh, that can be a sign that they have more musculature in that region. As a veterinarian, if the dog's actually in front of me and as I'm examining it, I can look and assess them. And one of the things you assess on their physical exam is you look at their body condition score and their muscle condition score. So you're looking at how much fat they have, and a certain amount of body fat is normal and is a good thing, but you see, are they underweight or overweight based on the amount of extra kind of padding that they have there. But then besides their fat, we also want to look at their muscling, and do they have a normal amount of muscle, or are they a dog who's starting to get some atrophy of their muscle, especially as they get older or with certain diseases? We can actually see muscle loss. And so that's one of those things that you can measure based on these specific measurements that they're going to be asking about in the upcoming.
Cool. Thank you. So stay tuned, pack members. Get your measuring tapes ready. Okay, so if we click on colors, I'm going to go through these. We won't belabor this point too much, but here's Puppy Gilda. I just wanted you to see Puppy Gilda with that cute belly. Color is very complicated. It involves many regions of the genome, and we're going to skip to coat pattern and white spotting, other genetic regions, but they or other physical traits. These all interact with each other, right? So there might be coat patterning genes that then are influenced by color and vice versa. So suffice it to say, it's very complicated, and we give you a lot of similar information about all the different genes that are at play. But what I wanted you to notice with my puppy picture, right, is that this is saying the prediction based on just Gilda's DNA is that she should have a solid black coat, but also maybe some cream. Okay, so as a puppy, she was almost totally black, but as I showed you in the other picture, she has some cream now. Okay, so coat pattern. So this is super interesting because, again, this is about where you have different blobs of color on the dog's body, basically. And based on Gilda's genetic information, we predict her coat patterns to have tan points that are hidden. So you remember from Gilda's picture, she didn't have any tan points at all, but these are Gilda's parents. So I saw that. I'm like, oh, look, our geneticists are so awesome. 10 points hidden. Look at mom. This is perfect. So I thought that was pretty cool. We look at whites. We give you some information about spotting. Also, Gilda has no spots. And so she's right there on the far right. But again, look at all of the different genes that are involved in white spotting. That's really interesting. And they're all interacting in ways that lead to the unique color pattern of your dog. One of the things that people might notice is that the genetic predictions on their genomic reports do not match their dog as well as Gilda's match her. And that is okay. That's because of all of these different interactions. After you receive the genomic report, you'll have an opportunity to complete a really short survey where you tell us what we got wrong, right? You might say, yeah, it predicted this, that no white spotting, but in fact, my dog has white boots or white on the end of her nose or whatever. And that's all information that we want to know because it will help us to improve the statistical accuracy of our prediction models. We talk to people about coat type. There is Fluffy Gilda again. And again, this was pretty accurate for Gilda, right? She has a curly coat, pretty long coat. She has crazy eyebrows and a crazy beard. And she's pretty low shedding, but not no shedding, right? She's as a first generation poodle cross, she still sheds some. So I also thought that was very interesting. And finally, our geneticists have looked at some really interesting gene locations that are known to influence things like high altitude adaptation. Gilda will not be summiting Mount Everest. Obviously, she's not going to be able to do that, right? I think our geneticist told me that we've had 2 dogs so far that have the genes for high altitude adaptation, so they can go to Mount Everest. Yeah. So anyway, again, with Gilda, all of these physical predictions purely based on her genetics were spot on. Normal tail length, leg length, all of that. Okay. Okay, so this is where I wanted to just remind folks that we have a lot of materials to help them understand their genomic report. If you go to our Zendesk help desk and click on the participant FAQs, you will be able to go to a section called Obtaining and Using the DNA Kit, which I think I can show you. Has lots and lots of interesting information about the genomic results. So please check that out if you want to know more. We also have a bunch of blog posts that are up on our blog where you can, where different members of our research team have written about everything from like how we use the genetics to make those trait predictions that I showed you, to more on inbreeding and what that really means. So I'd love for everybody to check this out if you want to know more. And I think that was the last slide I have. So I'm going to stop sharing and go to your questions. All righty. All right, let me see where we can start. So some of these questions I think Dr. Forsyth has already addressed a little bit. Okay, here's a very specific question for you. Are there genetic markers for autoimmune issues? And if so, are they Do they show up repeatedly in the genome sequence? Do you know anything about autoimmune, genetics of autoimmune disorders? I do not personally.
I don't know of any specific genetic tests for autoimmune disorders. I know there are several different autoimmune disorders that dogs can get, just like there are many different autoimmune conditions in people. I would assume, but this is just kind of me taking a guess, that if there was a genetic test, it would be specific for the specific autoimmune condition, not necessarily the same for all of them, although there may be some similarities. But to my knowledge, there are not any specific genetic tests for autoimmune disorders in dogs.
Got it. Let me see. So here's a question. The special features section, so that was the summiting Mount Everest section, for this participant's dog stated no eyebrow or muzzle furnishings. She was wondering what that term furnishings means.
Well, I don't know probably the exact definition, but what I think of it is all of the the beard and whiskers they get on their face, the big poofy eyebrows. I kind of think of if you think of a schnauzer, how they have the big prominent eyebrows, they have that big kind of handsome beard on their chin there. That's what I think of with furnishings, but I don't know if that's the exact definition.
That's what I think of it too. I wonder, that seems like it is sort of a breed standard kind of term. And I don't know a lot about breeding specifically. But that is how I have understood it as well. Okay, let me look at some of these other questions. Okay, so this is, okay, so we've had a couple questions about the unknown percentage in the breed calls. And also about how, I'm going to try to answer a couple questions all at once here. So here's the questions. Mixed breed dogs are not always crosses between purebred dogs. So that is one thing that can be hard to capture, and not all commercial test kits actually capture that. So the way I'm just going to tell folks a little bit about how the analytics work. We have constructed what we call a breed panel. And so that has over 100 purebred dogs. Each of those breeds, we have at least 12 full genome sequences for 12 different individuals. So 12 Dobermans, 12 Schnauzers, all of that. And we want to have those 12 represent as much genetic variation within the breed as possible. So I don't want 12 Dobermans that are all from the same litter. I want Dobermans from a whole bunch of different breeding lines. Okay. In addition to those entrants in the breed panel, we have representative genomic sequence from what we call ancestral or village populations of dogs. So these are the dogs that never have come from purebred lines, right? There's the Warm Springs Indian Reservation near my house the dogs there have a very conserved look. They have pretty much the same coat color, ears, they look very similar. They're not from any purebred lines, but they have been living in community with the folks in Warm Springs for generations. So that is what would be called an ancestral dog population. And so we have representatives of multiple populations like that from all around the world, as well as wolf DNA represented in the panels. So then we take a genomic sequence like Gil does, and we throw it up against that whole panel. And we can see if there are matches with specific breeds. So she obviously matched with poodles, Labradors, but she had a big other component too. But none of that 12% that made up the other in her genomic report, that was of a high enough percentage to actually be statistically relevant, right? So if we went into that 12%, we might see I don't know, Kelpie, Schnauzer, like, I don't know what we would see. We would see other things, or we would see like ancestral dogs. Probably not any wolf, knowing Gilda. But none of it was enough to make us feel confident that we could really say that that's where that genetic material came from. Does that, I mean, do you have anything else to add about how we understand ancestry?
I think you explained it pretty well, and that, we're not looking at every single purebred line ever. We're looking at the ones that we have the information on, and we still do have quite a large panel of breeds to look through, but we're not saying that it is always going to be this purebred, this purebred, this purebred. You're going to have some mixes. And even if you're seeing mixes showing up on your breed report, that doesn't mean that the parents of your dog were those purebreds. They might be also a mixed breed dog who happened to have some of those mixes in them.
Right.
And it's where you have to look, and it's not a perfect system, but it's one that the more information we have and the more DNA tests that are run, the more accurate it gets.
Yeah, and we will be constantly adding new breed references to the panel. We'll be expanding the panel. When we do that, we will have the ability to update and refine results. The other thing that some people might find is that if they have a relatively rare breed that is not represented in our breed panel, the analysis will identify that dog as the closest relative to the unrepresented breed. So maybe you have a flat-coated retriever. If that's not in the breed panel, it'll show up as a Labrador retriever because it's close. So some of you might find that, and that's definitely the information we want to know in that feedback survey.
I'd also say you might have a dog that you can say, I know for certain my dog is purebred. I have the paperwork, whatever. Why does my breed report show a small percentage of some other breed?
Oh, yeah.
That's because there's a lot of overlap between breeds as well. Mm-hmm. So just because you know that your dog is a purebred Labrador or purebred, whichever breed it is, the DNA might share some characteristics with other breeds. And so it may show up as having a small percentage of some other breed also on their breed call.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. That answers a question, I think, about, I've never even heard of a Bavarian mountain scenthound, but I want to hear about it. But I guess this pack member's DNA breakdown had a lot of things that didn't make any sense, like pugs and toy poodles. And so that could be why, right? Just because there are these very conserved regions of DNA. I would be really interested to know more about that specific case for sure. Okay, let's see. On the same vein, right? Why one person is asking why there might be differences in the genetic results or even the breed calls that we provide versus a different kit. And that has to do with the reference panels being different. Most of the commercial companies, their reference panels are proprietary, and so they don't share those. Maybe this is a good time just to give a shout out for the fact that the Dog Aging Project is what we call an open data project, which means all of the information that we collect will be made publicly available. We consider it a public good so that all researchers all around the world can access these data to ask their own scientific questions. And that includes the genetic data, but not anybody's personal information.
Yes.
We remove all of that. Personal information, anything that could identify you or your dog, is removed before these data are made public. So someone asked if we're working with other DNA collection companies like Embark or Wisdom. They're all our colleagues, but we work very closely with them, or we know them, but we're not collaborating in terms of researchers. We do collaborate with Darwin's Ark. So a lot of our geneticists are also part of Darwin's Ark. So we are definitely BFFs with Darwin's Ark. Let's see. I know there are a few more logistical questions. I think we'll jump back to those, but first I kind of wanted to get back to some of the more veterinary type questions. Let's see. Well, one question was about sharing the genetic information with a particular dog's veterinarian. Would the study ever consider at least releasing the information to the dog's veterinarian so the animal could still be screened or monitored for a potential disease? That's a good question. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that's asking about information that might relate to specific diseases and not just your information that we already kind of talked about with the genomic reports. And that would depend on what information becomes available, because right now, kind of, I think you described it a little bit at the beginning of saying one thing that researchers can look into with this data is hopefully to develop or to recognize new genes that are associated with specific diseases. So we can say we've got these genome sequenced for all of these dogs. We can look at the answers from the Health and Life Experience survey that say, oh, hey, look, all of these dogs who have this certain disease or medical condition are showing similarities between these particular genes. And then we can look at that in the future and say, hey, well, maybe we should look for dogs who have this gene and check and see, hey, do they happen to have this disease? Because if we're finding that all of the dogs with this gene are also having this disease or medical condition, that might be a screening test for the future. And so that's one of the cool things that we will hopefully be able to learn from this data, and from this data becoming open source for other researchers to look at it similarly like that. I think it would depend when that kind of information became available, if it would be useful to then go back to veterinarians, because this kind of research takes a long time, right? Like a very long time to actually develop and learn these new genes to use for testing. So obviously we want to learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can, but it might potentially be years down the line before we actually find out what some of these genes are that are associated with specific medical conditions. So I don't know logistically if we would be able to go back and share that.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because what you're making me think is that it's actually this cumulative knowledge gain that is far more valuable even for an individual pet, right? Like it's less valuable to give the genome sequence for Gilda to Gilda's veterinarian. Like what are they going to do with that? Right? It's a big giant mess. But if the dog aging project is like, hey, everybody who has dogs who have this condition, we really need to be paying attention to this genetic sequence, that's actionable for all dogs, including Gilda. Mm-hmm. If if the discoveries are made in a timely fashion. So I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I do think that those of us who are participants in the project know that the biggest benefit will be to future generations of dogs. But certainly if our project makes discoveries that are actionable in a clinical way, we're going to tell everybody right away. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes us different than for-profit companies too, right? We're not going to be like, oh, this is actionable and now I'm going to develop a product that I can sell to people. We're going to be like, this is actionable now, let's take care of it, people, because we're not a for-profit company. Let's see. All right, if we can't get to all of these questions, and some of them are sort of specific, we will answer on the dog park. Couple quick things. We've been asked if we were using CRISPR. Not yet. The second was really sort of what's the purpose of the genomic report if potential medical conditions aren't included. So do you want to address that? Or do you want me to?
Yeah. Well, some of it's going to come from even just getting those breed calls and finding out that information of what breeds does your pet specifically have, even though that's not going to tell us necessarily, are they at higher risk for a specific disease? You know that maybe your dog is a breed, so you can be aware of what are some diseases that that breed is predisposed to. Again, that's not necessarily saying your dog is going to get that disease, because it depends on how common the disease is in the first place to what their actual risk is of it. But it gives your veterinarian the knowledge of knowing, hey, this is actually what my patient's breed is, because that's one of the things as a veterinarian you're thinking about for any time a pet comes in. You know, we want to know how old they are and, you know, their gender and what their breed is, because there's a lot of, granted they're guesses, but educated guesses you can make based on that information for what are diseases or medical conditions that they are at more risk for. So what are things that I should be monitoring for, thinking about? Now, if you said you already knew for sure that your dog is a purebred, whatever that specific breed is, and your genomic report comes back and agrees that, yes, you have a purebred dog that's 100% the breed you thought it is, it's probably not going to change a lot of what your veterinarian would do with that information. But if you have a dog where you're not entirely sure, or you're finding out that there are some other breeds involved in the mix, that does give them some information, at least of things to think about as just things to monitor for as far as diseases go. And then again, the benefit is not just for your specific dog, but it's the overall research and what we're going to be able to do to help dogs in general in the future. So even if, you know, obviously we want the research to happen fast enough to help all of the dogs right now, but even if that's not possible, this research may help the next dog you get down the line as we come up with more discoveries from the future.
I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but there were a couple specific questions about if you knew if, well, just a couple specific things. Are there genetic markers for kidney disease in dogs?
I would assume there are, but I don't know what they are specifically. I haven't heard of any specific genetic tests related to kidney disease. I would suspect there are probably multiple genes involved in that. But that's something for us to look for.
This is a random question that just popped into my own head, which was about, you know, there's a fair degree of similarity between human genomic sequences and canine sequences. I wonder how much crossover there is in diagnostics. Be curious about that. And what about Cushing's disease? Is that a condition that's correlated to certain breeds? It's one of our questions.
That, I believe there are certain breeds that are more predisposed to Cushing's disease compared to others. However, that is one that is seen across many breeds. So Cushing's disease is affecting the adrenal glands. So that's something that we can see across multiple breeds, but there are certain breeds that are predisposed to it over others.
There was a very important question about Gilda, which I feel like must be addressed before we conclude. So in the photo that I showed of Gilda's parents, the non-poodle dog looked a lot like a husky breed, not so much like a lab. Totally agree with you. The thing that was interesting is that Gilda's mom and her aunt, who were litter mates, we met both of them, and her aunt looked like she was 100% yellow lab. So Gilda's mom is clearly some kind of a lab mix, and I was really curious to know what the other was, but obviously the other was not decipherable in our particular analysis. But yes, I agree. I think she looks kind of husky-ish too. I think we have addressed most of these. Some of these that we haven't gotten to, we'll answer on the dog park since they're pretty specific. Do you have any last things you want to add about genomics before we sort of do a little bit of a close up?
I guess one thing I would say is if you have a dog that comes from a shelter, kind of related back to that last question where you're saying, oh, it looks more like a husky. Appearance is basically how any dogs who come from shelters, for the most part, get their breed call. So if you adopt a dog from a shelter and it says that it is a terrier mix or a chihuahua mix or a dachshund mix or whatever it looks like, it's because the doctors and the volunteers and the staff members there looked at it and said, I think that looks like this. And so they just write it down, and that then becomes its breed for all that anyone knows, because usually dogs coming from shelters, we don't know who their parents were. We don't know what their breeds are. So it's entirely based off of their appearance. So sometimes you'll find that what they look like is not exactly related to their breed. So, if her mom came from a shelter, they might have said, this is a husky mix because that's just what she looks like. But you wouldn't actually know until you get the DNA test back and find out, oh, hey, this is actually a lab who just happens to have a patterning similar to a husky.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And like geneticist here, I'm just saying when you have genetic admixture, even if you take purebred lines, it does not take very many generations for all of those carefully cultivated traits to just go crazy and do all sorts of wild things, because genetics is so complicated. And so many of these traits are multigenic, right? They're influenced by multiple genes. Yeah, genetics is cool. I love it. So I would strongly recommend that folks refer to some of those blog posts. At least 2 of them are linked in the description below this video. We'll add the other ones to the dog park. There's some really great, more in-depth material there. And just in terms of a little bit of an update, we are finally enrolling dogs in TRIAD. So that's the clinical trial that you're so involved with. How many dogs have we enrolled?
I believe we have 15 so far who have passed their initial screening exam and are started on the medications. We've definitely screened more than that, but part of that first screening exam is we're looking for dogs who are overall kind of an average representation of an older, healthy dog. And so if in part of their initial exam, we're finding new diseases for them, some of those dogs then end up getting excluded, but it still is good to get them screened. You're finding out sometimes surprise medical information that you wouldn't have otherwise known about your dog, which is great to know that. And for a lot of them, they're getting to join the study, and can't wait to see what that clinical trial shows us as far as if this is a medication that's going to help them live longer and stay healthier.
Yeah. And, the health and safety of the dogs in the program is our top priority, right? So if there's anything that you see on an exam that might make you think, I'm not sure this dog, is a good fit for this study, then we want to know that, right? Because we want to take good care of everybody's dogs.
Their health is the most important thing.
One of the things I wanted to tell y'all too is that we're going to be launching a more in-depth look at cognitive health in dogs as well. So stay tuned for a lot more really interesting information about that expansion to our study. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Jocelyn. She's the newest member of our team that puts on these shows. So she's in the background making sure all of these things are working well for everybody. So thank you, Jocelyn. We're so glad that you're here. And then just a reminder, so follow the link in the video description to go to the dog park, post a comment, you'll be entered into our giveaway. And we are really looking forward to seeing everybody next month. We're going to be talking more about working dogs, so be thinking about that. And finally, we just wanted to let you know that we are still enrolling dogs, especially dogs that are up to like age 3. and in sort of the middle region of the United States, right? So kind of just the center of the map, those are areas where we don't really have enough dogs. So if you have any friends who live in those areas who have dogs who might want to participate, please consider sharing information about the Dog Aging Project with them. Thank you so much for being with me today, Kiersten. This has been really fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody. See you next month.
Bye.